Welcome back to the podcast Teachability, teaching about sustainable cities and communities in the classroom.
So in today's episode, we will be talking about the goal 11.1 of SDG Goal 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities, that states that by 2030, we want to ensure access for all to adequate, safe, and affordable housing and basic services. And we will also be including sustainable housing in this discussion. I would like to introduce our new guest today, which is Monique Seep Donahue. Please tell us about yourself.
Well, hello. It's very nice to be on this program. I feel honored to be part of your podcast. Let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Monique Seep Donahue. I am a new staff member at ITEPS, the International Teaching Education for Primary Schools. I have worked overseas as an international teacher in primary schools for around about 16 years, and I've now returned to my native country, which is the Netherlands, to take up this interesting challenge of teaching the new generation of teachers for primary schools.
Could you please tell us about the different countries and age groups you've worked with?
Yes, I have worked in, let's start at the beginning, Turkey, Singapore, China, the Philippines, and Korea. And I've worked with ages ranging from 5 to 12.
Wow, what a range of experiences. Very interesting. Have you lived anywhere else prior to your teaching career?
Yes, I grew up overseas in the Caribbean on a small island called Aruba, and I was there between the ages of 4 and 14, and that's what shaped me and my desire to explore different countries and different cultures, and that's how I ended up where I am today.
That's wonderful. So getting into our topic for the day, in your opinion, what is the purpose of this SDG number 11?
SDG 11.1 is a very important goal. One of them is that if people don't have a safe place that they can call home, where they feel protected and they have access to sanitation that is safe, it's a really difficult challenge for anyone living in those conditions to do well in school, to be able to care for family members, to stay healthy, to be able to do the best in their work environment. So it's a paramount piece of the puzzle when it comes to making sure that everyone is able to participate in the equitable planet of tomorrow.
So one of the reasons we chose to speak to you, as you know, specifically about this topic, is that you have quite a bit of experience in actual sustainable housing. So what sort of housing did you used to live in?
I had the privilege to live 6 months in a project that was set up by the collaboration between the city of Groningen, which is in the north of the Netherlands, and a property developer whose leadership is very much interested in developing alternative construction methods that are a lot more sustainable for the environment, not just to live in, but also to construct and deconstruct. Currently, only 30% of housing materials of buildings that are being deconstructed can be reused. And also, a lot of water and fossil fuels are used in the construction of housing. We have a large need for the construction of housing in the Netherlands, and a lot of pressure is put by the government on the building sector to provide these housing opportunities. But that means that if we're going to build these houses with the old methods, that will take a large toll on the environment. And this particular housing project was built as a prototype of a new way of building, which relies less so on traditional construction materials and traditional construction methods, for which there's less fossil fuels needed and less water needed. Plus, all the materials that are used can, or not all, but by far the greatest majority of materials that are used in the building process, construction process, can be reused after deconstructing the property.
That's fascinating. So why did you decide to live there, and what did you expect before you got there?
Well, we decided to live there because we were looking for permanent housing, but that is a bit of a challenge because we moved from overseas. And so we were looking for temporary housing so that we would be able to buy a property because it's the most financially viable option in the long term. And this project was set up by a construction company together with the city. And they alerted us through some of these real estate agencies that help people find temporary housing for rent. And I thought it was a fantastic initiative. And not only did it fit my ideology and what we hope the future of housing looks like in this country, but also it was perfect because having moved from overseas, we did not have anything to furnish our house with, and it came fully furnished. It had everything we needed to sort of conduct our daily lifestyle, so there was even cutlery in the drawer, and there were towels in the bathroom, so it was a turnkey, short stay solution for us. So it fitted our needs perfectly.
That's great. So what did you expect before you got there?
I didn't know what to expect really because we were the first inhabitants of a brand new project, and when we arrived in July, we were going to move in August. It didn't look like anything was near ready, but we knew that many of the elements of the houses were going to be prefabricated somewhere else and brought over. So we could see that the foundations had been laid and the infrastructure in terms of sewage and water and all of that was already in place. So the only things we knew was from a picture, a three-dimensional picture on a computer, what we think it was going to look like. But we could only see the outside because there were no pictures of the inside, obviously, because they hadn't drawn them. And we knew that the house was going to have solar panels and was going to be energy neutral, very well insulated. It was going to have floor heating. And we also knew from the description on the internet that the heat in the water that we were going to wash down the drain was going to be reused and put into the floor heating so that none of the energy was going to be lost. And it exceeded our expectations, I must say. It was an incredible experience to live there. We had solar panels on the roof, like I said, and we had a herb garden outside. There were neighbors that were all very excited about the project, and so it was easy to meet people and talk about it. There was a variety of different units available, so there were family homes, such smaller ones, such as which we lived in, but there were also single and studio apartments for singles or couples. Yeah, and it was an interesting location because it was based on a former sugar factory site that was razed partly, and that's now used for all kinds of experimental projects that the city stimulates to be developed. So if you have an interesting project that you want to develop and you need space and you need a piece of land, the government will give you space on that site in order to pilot your startup or
Wow. So that sounds really safe and sustainable. Would you say it's also affordable and inclusive?
I'd say, we just paid rent. It wasn't cheap, but I'd say it's equally comparable to buying a house and paying a mortgage. But the rent we paid was totally inclusive of all of our utilities, including Wi-Fi, because there was no electricity meter. It's all built into the system. So there's no utilities really that need to be part of that type of housing. It's a self-contained unit that generates its own electricity and heats its own water. So you probably need a water supply, and for that you will need the government or some kind of infrastructure that gives you access to a water supply because there's no wells. And you need sewage, so you need to be hooked up to the sewage system of the city, unless you do that yourself too, because you could go off-grid. But other than that, it's self-sustained.
That's amazing. From your knowledge of being a worldwide traveler and having such cultural experiences, do you think that this kind of project would be possible somewhere else?
Definitely. Absolutely. I don't see why we wouldn't be changing to this kind of building everywhere right now. I mean, I've lived in Korea and we moved into a brand new building that was like, say, 2 years old, 42 stories, 8 apartments per floor, 2 towers, about 6 years ago. No, it was built 6 years ago and we moved in there 4 or 5 years ago, and nothing was insulated. We didn't have double glazing, the walls weren't insulated, so In the spring, it always felt cold and it was warmer outside than inside the house, and same in the fall. In the summer, we had to run the AC, and in the winter, we had heating, but it was not sustainable. I don't know why building is still being done like that. I think it's mainly to do with existing expertise, existing supply chains that provide all the construction materials, and there's a whole industry that's built up around the building industry like that. So that's probably why it's just still happening the way it is, because it's easy.
So in your opinion, this problem would require systemic change?
Yes, absolutely. Actually, to be honest, I think it won't happen if the government doesn't lay down regulations that prevent corporations, businesses, construction companies to change their ways, because otherwise they'll just keep doing it the way they're doing it, because everyone's trained to do it like that, and everyone in the industry keep using the same methods, and also because they have developed a system that is cost efficient for them, so they don't see any reason to change other than for ideological purposes.
Would you say that this would require new knowledge, or do you think the research is already out there, just not being used?
I think it's probably both. I think it's probably a matter of re-educating, and it's a matter of also running more pilot projects to see which ones are most cost efficient and easiest to build new infrastructure around.
Wow, you're like your own expert on this topic already, only having lived there 6 months.
Yeah, no.
It's fascinating. So what would you say the impacts of this whole experience are in your life? How has it contributed to you becoming a sustainable citizen?
I don't call myself a sustainable citizen by any means, but I strive to be one. I think there's many more things we can do, and I do believe that we need to be nudged. I think it's really important that the government steps up and creates legislation and regulations that stimulate businesses to develop new ways of doing things that have much smaller impact on the environment. Otherwise, they will just go for the most cost-effective method. And even families are under financial pressure, so they will do the same. They will try and use the most cost-effective methods to design their lives, the logistical part of their lives. So for them they'll need to be nudged either with subsidies or with ways that they can easily implement changes in their housing situation that will yield financial gains. Otherwise, they won't do it.
So has this experience mainly altered your mindset on the topic, or maybe your knowledge?
I think I always had the mindset, but I didn't know how to go about making changes. And I think having seen now that people have been inspired to make changes against all odds, even without the legislation and the regulations not being in place yet, makes me realize that there is a lot possible. And I think what we need to do now is work together with people who are of a like mind and mindset to put pressure on those that make decisions like this to change. Yeah.
So of course you've already said it, but why do you think this sustainable housing, or sustainable housing in general, is so important?
Because I think we're wasting too much energy. And a lot of energy is being wasted in the construction of housing and in the destruction of housing. So much more can be done. We won't need to spend energy that is wasted. That way we can be a lot more efficient, and we'll have room for more people. It can be a cyclical system.
Have you been in touch with this SDG goal somewhere else in your life? So other aspects include safe, affordable, and sustainable transport, green public spaces, housing, as we talked about, and also protecting natural heritage sites.
Mm-hmm. I've seen it everywhere. It's incredible how much this is linked to our everyday life, really. I was in Colombia last summer, and Colombia used to suffer from, it still does to some extent, a large problem related to narcotics trafficking. And it really caused a lot of disruption economically as well as socially. And through concerted efforts of a new government that had a very strong vision about equality and access to safe and affordable housing and transportation, In a city like Bogota, but Medellin also, the governments worked together with a common goal, and that was to make people who lived in slums have access to transportation so that they could get to a job, and to protect these slums from dangers such as burglaries and the like, as well as providing education in places where the local kids could access them. So they put together this huge plan which they carried out, and schooling became much more accessible. They built huge escalators and cable cars up the mountainsides where all these slums were located. They provided clean water and sewage in many of these places so people would have access to, to make it easier for people to lead healthy lives. And it's changed everything because of them having access to these kinds of things. People didn't feel compelled to join gangs, seek employment, or seek ways to make money through illegal activities because there was access to services. Transportation systems throughout the cities were much, much, much improved. They put in bus lanes in which you can't drive with your car. They put in lots of fast buses so people could get quickly from one place to another. So you weren't stuck in crowded little minibuses in a huge traffic jam half your work day. It's incredible what they've been able to accomplish. And, people had actually given up on countries like Colombia and thought it's just a bunch of drug barons and terrorists that are hiding in the jungle. But they've been able to make huge changes for the better for millions of people. So it's really incredible and gives a lot of hope.
And what a wonderful example of how all the SDG goal aspects are so interconnected.
Yeah,
for example, how the slums, how the transport affected the housing, and how the housing affected the jobs,
yes,
and how much money people make, which then affects the sustainable choices that people can make.
That's right, and therefore also education of children who then have better opportunities. So, yeah.
Of course, quality education is also so important.
Yeah.
So just to round off our talk about the SDG goal in particular, why is this SDG goal so important to you?
I think everything's connected, and I think, just like you mentioned, because everything is connected and affects each other, you can't really work on one element of improving a society or the way you want to improve an element of society without having a master plan that affects everything. And so if you care about poverty, you need to care about sanitation, about education, about transportation. So you can't just say, well, we're going to create jobs. If you create jobs because people will then be lifted out of poverty, you also need to create infrastructure. You also need to create schools so that children can go to school and be educated to actually carry out these jobs. You need to fight crime so people feel safe. There are so many things that are interconnected. And at the same time, the environment is very much positively affected by all of these choices.
I totally agree. So going into more of our teaching part of this discussion, first of all, do you think it is important to teach children about this strand of SDG goal number 11?
Yes, I believe so. I think it's really important because it relates directly to their lives. And I think it's really important that they can see that other children lead lives that are very similar to theirs, except for that they might not have access to certain services that kids in international schools or in public schools in better off countries have access to. I have found in my own teaching practice that many students feel enriched when they learn more about how everything is interconnected and how they can make a difference, no matter how small, to a better life and a better future for our planet, which it will ultimately benefit them.
So how would you implement this in your teaching?
I think it's really important that you give students control and an opportunity to research things that they care about, even if it means something like homelessness or abandoned pets or AI and technology or air pollution, because everything is interconnected. By doing factual research, by speaking to people who have knowledge about these topics, by consolidating their learning and presenting it to others, and by speaking to one another about it, they can see how everything is interconnected, and they can come up with simple solutions for small problems that they see around themselves.
So in what way could you perhaps come up with a concrete activity or form in which a teacher could bring this part of the SDG goal and teach it, and not only change mindsets, but also change behaviors?
Mm-hmm. I think first of all, students need to have all the knowledge they can get about a topic that they feel strongly about. So you need to have access to resources related to any SDG or any topic that the kids are passionate about. So research skills are a very important element in this. How do you find resources that you can trust? How are you going to evaluate them? How are you going to extract the information from these sources that answer your questions? How are you then going to use this information and put it in a manageable, presentable format so that you can inform others about it and create awareness? So I think skills such as research skills, communication skills on how to share this kind of information, social skills because you need to work together with others to make this happen, time management skills so that you are aware of how your portion of a project affects what happens with the others in your group, making sure that you're ready in time to share the information to whomever you've decided you're going to share it with. All of those are very important skills.
So in what ways could you make this SDG goal, since it could be pretty far from a student, especially since they don't pay rent and they don't really deal with the choices of housing, how could you make it closer to them and have more of an impact on them and allow them to empathize with the different situations you're looking into?
I think taking field trips is a really powerful way to do it. I think in any country where you live, you can go on a tour of your neighborhood and look at what kind of housing do we have, what kind of facilities are available for the people who live here. So how is this community connected to other communities through transportation links, and how do you get from one place to another? And if you do first-hand research where students have a critical look to observe what's already in a community and what can be improved, what needs there are by maybe speaking to people who live in that community, by talking to shopkeepers, by talking to bus drivers, by talking to people who make use of the park. They can construct a picture of what's already available, what's missing, and what would they like to have, and how could they get that. So I'd say field research is your first go-to.
And how would you suggest teachers allow the students to feel like they have an impact even in places where it's not a democratic society and you don't get as much of a say in the government choices?
I think as long as you keep it small, which is what kids can manage, even if you are living in a not so democratic society, you can still have kids make positive impacts. So you could walk out the school gates and turn left or turn right or go straight and find out what's around your school and talk to people and see if they have anything that they would like to improve in their environment. And it could be as simple as a community garden, or maybe help doing the shopping, or maybe some extra support lessons after school for children who are less privileged and might not have an opportunity to do activities outside school, or starting a sports club. All of those things are possible, or maybe raising money for something that kids like themselves might need near them. In a school where I taught in China, we worked together very closely with an NGO that was very well connected locally, and there are a lot of migrants who move from the countryside to large cities in China. And if they bring their children with them, the children are not allowed to enroll in the local public school because of a system that China uses, and that's called the Hukao system. So that means there's a registration that is linked to your birthplace, and it's very difficult to move it to a big city. And ultimately, the big city administration, government, is responsible for giving you this kind of registration. And if you don't have a registration, that means you're not officially a resident of that city. You cannot enroll your child in a local public school. So parents who can't leave their children behind 500, 1,000 kilometers away from their birthplace or where they were raised, then don't see any other way but to start their own schools in usually buildings that are not safe, that are not heated, that are not properly set up to be schools, because they use empty factories or anything. Because these are migrant workers, they don't make a lot of money. They work in factories themselves, and they have to provide for their families, but they can't pay private school tuition fees. So they often then find a local business person who will then operate the school, who will find fairly new untrained teachers because nobody else will want to work there. They'd rather go and work in the public school system. So teachers that can't get into the public school system that are trained by the government will come and work in these schools. So the building's not safe. The teachers aren't experienced. The materials are old and dilapidated. And so even though it's a society in which things are unequal and it's not democratic, you can still, with a group of children, decide to maybe, what we did in that case was we noticed that a lot of kids needed glasses. Parents can't afford glasses, so we raised money to buy glasses. We worked together with an eye hospital, we worked together with this NGO, and we went and organized together with this NGO for the whole school of 1,200 students to get eye exams done by the eye hospital. They did that for free, and then the glasses were made, custom made for these children who needed them. So things are possible as long as you do it locally and you are not embarrassing your host country by making it very obvious that they have not provided for their own constituents as well as could have been.
That's a wonderful point, to make sure that you're still being amicable with the government so they do want to help. And I love how you were talking about really bringing into the lives of the students to make sure it actually relates to them. One thing I was interested in is how would you, in your classroom, see that your students could not only understand their own surroundings and the housing situations there, but also be able to relate to different places around the world. For example, if you work at a rather privileged school, how would you allow your students to understand the experiences in a lower status socioeconomically country?
That's not an easy task, but videos and a lot of well-developed materials that have been made available by NGOs such as Oxfam or similar kind of organizations are available, and they are very insightful and they're trustworthy. You can also design experiences in your classroom with your students or for your students in which they get to experience what it's like to do without something, and it really inspires them to make a difference for others who are less privileged than they are. For instance, we did a child labor experiment in which the students were together with grade 8 students who came over from the middle school, and this was in Korea, so kids were well fed and warm and safe. But the grade 8 students came over and designed this experience for them in which they had to fold paper hats, and these paper hats were worth this much money, and this much money then had to go to pay for the rent, which was like an artificial environment because they were just in a hall. And then they had to pay for school, and they had to pay for books, and they had to pay for food, and they were a family of 5, so they modeled as if they were a family of 5. And it was basically a poverty simulation. And these kinds of experiences, even though they're short, they're still safe, makes students realize that life's not the same for everybody.
Wow, that's really powerful. And it's such a wonderful way to allow your students to empathize with the experiences and the people that they're learning about, rather than just learning as a fact of numbers and whatnot, to actually really... on a real level and not an artificial one.
Right.
That's beautiful. So what tips can you give other teachers to take along for their own teaching, especially with teaching about sustainability?
I think it's really important to take your lead from the kids. So I think it's really important to create stimulating situations in which students can experience what something is like. For instance, something similar to the experience that I just talked about, like the poverty simulation, but you can do all kinds of other situations where you just go on field trips and you get kids to write down observations, and then why do you think this is this way? And why are some people lining up to go and get food at a food bank? What made them need to go to the food bank? Oh, maybe they don't have a job. Why do you think they don't have a job? Oh, are they all old or young? And why do you think that is? And then they often get inspired to find out more and ask questions. And they'll go home and ask their parents questions. Why this? Why that? Why do we have this? And why don't they? So there's inequality in every society. And just by creating experiences for them to be more aware, you can do them and our future planet a big service.
Thank you so much for speaking with me today, Ms. Monique. It was a wonderful experience. And this concludes our episode about sustainable cities and communities, covering sustainable, affordable, and safe housing.
You listened to episode 2 of the podcast Sustainability, teaching about sustainable cities and communities. Until next time, and as always, don't forget to be a sustainable citizen.